There we go. Hi, friends. Yeah, my name is Adam. I'm going to read two quick little Shakespeare sonnets. Sonnet number 116 and 160. No, 65. All right. Here is number 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when its alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, excuse me, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So that was Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare. Here is number 65. Since brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays? O fearful meditation, where alack shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? O none, unless this miracle have might, that in my black ink my love may still shine bright. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Adam. Wonderful job. We're off to a great start, so thank you. Next up, we have Bhavana, who I will also let her introduce the reading that she is doing. So Bhavana, take it away.
Thank you. So tonight I'll be reading Sleeping Beauty by Charles Perrault. So, once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who were very sorry that they had no children. So sorry that it cannot be told. At last, however, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the whole kingdom. There were 7 of them, so that every one of them might confer a gift upon her, as was the custom of fairies in those days. By this means the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the christening was over, the company returned to the king's palace, where was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein were a spoon, a knife, and a fork, all of pure gold set, with diamonds and rubies. But as they were all sitting down at table, they saw a very old fairy come into the hall. She had not been invited because for more than 50 years she had not been out of a certain tower, and she was believed to be either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but he could not give her a case of gold as the others had, because 7 only had been made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted, and muttered threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat near heard her, and judging that she might give the little princess some unlucky gift, hid herself behind the curtains as soon as they left the table. She hoped that she might speak last and undo as much as she could the evil which the old fairy might do. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her for her gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should be able to do everything she did gracefully. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all kinds of musical instruments to the fullest perfection. The old fairy's turn coming next, her head shaking more with spite than with age, she said that the princess should pierce her hand with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell a-crying. At this very instant the young fairy came from behind the curtains and said these words in a loud voice. Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true I have no power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with the spindle, but instead of dying she shall only fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her. The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, issued orders forbidding anyone, on pain of death, to spin with a distaff and spindle, or to have a spindle in his house. About 15 or 16 years after, the king and queen being absent at one of their country villas, the young princess was one day running up and down the palace. She went from room to room, and at last she came into a little garret on the top of the tower, where a good old woman, alone, was spinning with her spindle. The good woman had never heard of the king's orders against spindles. "What are you doing there, my good woman?" said the princess. "I'm spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who the princess was. "Ha!" said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it? Give it to me. Let me see if I can do it." She had no sooner taken it into her hands than, either because she was too quick and heedless, or because the decree of the fairy had so ordained, it ran into her hand and she fell down in a swoon. The good old woman, not knowing what to do, cried out for help. People came in from every quarter. They threw water upon the face of the princess, unlaced her, struck her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with cologne water, but nothing would bring her to herself. Then the king, who came up at hearing the noise, remembered what the fairies had foretold. He knew very well that this must come to pass, since the fairies had foretold it, and he caused the princess to be carried into the finest room in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for a little angel, she was so beautiful, for her swooning had not dimmed the brightness of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation and her lips coral. It is true her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which satisfied those about her that she was not dead. The king gave orders that they should let her sleep quietly till the time came for her to awake. The good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was in the kingdom of Matakan, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess. But she was instantly informed of it by a little dwarf who had 7-leagued boots, that is, boots with which you could stride over 7 leagues of ground at once. The fairy started off at once and arrived about an hour later in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of the chariot, and she approved everything he had done, but as she had very great foresight, she thought that when the princess should awake she might not know what to do with herself, if she was all alone in this old palace. This was what she did. She touched with her wand everything in the palace, except the king and queen. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, kitchen maids, guards with their porters, pages, and footmen. She likewise touched all the horses which were in the stables, the cart horses, the hunters, and the saddle horses, the grooms, the great dogs in the outward court, and little Mopsy too, the princess's spaniel, which was lying on the bed. As soon as she touched them, they all fell asleep, not to awake again until their mistress did, that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits at the fire, as full as they could hold of partridges and pheasants, fell asleep, and the fire itself as well. All this was done in a moment. Fairies are not long in doing their work. And now the king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and sent forth orders that nobody should come near it. These orders were not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around about the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, twining one within another, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that too only from afar off. Everyone knew that this also was the work of the fairy, in order that while the princess slept she should have nothing to fear from curious people. After 100 years, the son of the king then reigning, who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, was a hunting on that side of the country, and he asked what those towers were which he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone answered according as they had heard. Some said that it was an old haunted castle, others that all the witches of the country held their midnight revels there. But the common opinion was that it was an ogre's dwelling, and that he carried to it all the little children he could catch, so as to eat them up at his leisure, without anyone being able to follow him, for he alone had the power to make his way through the wood. The prince did not know what to believe, and presently a very aged countryman spoke to him thus: "May it please your royal highness, more than 50 years since I heard from my father that there was then in this castle the most beautiful princess that was ever seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and that she should be waked by a king's son for whom she was reserved." The young prince, on hearing this, was all on fire. He thought, without weighing the matter, that he could put an end to this rare adventure, and pushed on by love and the desire of glory, resolved at once to look into it. As soon as he began to get near to the wood, all the great trees, the bushes and brambles gave way of themselves to let him pass through. He walked up to the castle, which he saw at the end of a large avenue, and you can imagine he was a good deal surprised when he saw none of his people following him, because the trees closed again as soon as he had passed through them. However, he did not cease from continuing his way. A young prince in search of glory is ever valiant. He came into a spacious outer court, and what he saw was enough to freeze him with horror. A frightful silence reigned over all. The image of death was everywhere, and there was nothing to be seen but what seemed to be the outstretched bodies of dead men and animals. He, however, very well knew by the ruby faces and pimpled noses of the porters that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they had fallen asleep while drinking their wine. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where guards were standing in their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring with all their might. He went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, some standing and others sitting, but all were asleep. He came into a gilded chamber, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the most beautiful sight ever beheld. A princess who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and resplendent beauty had something divine in it. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down upon his knees before her. Then, as the end of the enchantment was come, the princess awoke, and looking on him with eyes more tender than could have been expected at first sight, said, "Is it you, my prince? You have waited a long while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. Their discourse was not very connected, but they were the better pleased, for where there is much love, there is little eloquence. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had had time to think about what to say to him. For it was evident, though history says nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very pleasant dreams. In short, they talked together for 4 hours, and then they said not half they had to say. In the meanwhile, All the palace had woke up with the princess. Everyone thought upon his own business, and as they were not in love, they were ready to die of hunger. The lady of honor, being as sharp set as the other folks, grew very impatient and told the princess aloud that the meal was served. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely and very magnificently dressed, but his royal highness took care not to tell her that she dressed like his great-grandmother and had a high collar. She looked not a bit the less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great mirrored hall, where they supped and were served by the officers of the princess's household. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but they were excellent, though they had not been playing for 100 years. And after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Almoner married the two lovers in the chapel of the castle. From thenceforth their love for each other knew no end and no bounds, and so they lived happily ever after. The end.
Thank you so much, Bhavana. What a great reading. Thank you for that wonderful second story there. All right, so next up, I believe we have here, we have Sarah Woolner reading next. And again, I will let her take it away and introduce what she'll be reading. So Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone, this is the old tale of Cinderella, also known as the Glass Slipper. And this is like honestly one of my favorite princess stories. So I was like, might as well choose this one. It's super cute. So yeah, we'll begin. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife the proudest and most haughty woman that ever was seen. She had two daughters of her own, who were indeed exactly like her in all things. The gentleman had also a young daughter, of rare goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. The wedding was scarcely over when the stepmother's bad temper began to show itself. She could not bear the goodness of this young girl because it made her own daughters appear the more odious. The stepmother gave her the meanest work in the house to do. She had to scour the dishes, tables, etc., and to scrub the floors and clean out the bathrooms. The poor girl had to sleep in the garret, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in the fine rooms with inlaid floors, upon beds of the very newest fashion, and where they had looking glasses so large that they might see themselves at their full length. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not complain to her father, who would have scolded her if she had done so, for his wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go to the chimney corner and sit down among the cinders. Hence she was called Cinderwitch. The younger sister of the two, who was not so rude and uncivil as the elder, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, in spite of her mean apparel, was 100 times more handsome than her sisters, though they were always richly dressed. It happened that the king's son gave a ball and invited it to all persons of fashion. Our young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the people of the countryside. They were highly delighted with the invitation and wonderfully busy in choosing the gowns, petticoats, and headdresses which might best become them. This made Cinderella's lot still harder, for it was she who ironed her sisters' linen and plaited their ruffles. They talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. For my part, said the elder, I will wear my red velvet suit with French trimmings. And I, said the younger, shall wear my usual skirt, but then to make amends for that, I will put on my gold flowered mantle and my diamond stomacher, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world. They sent for the best hairdressers they could get to make up their hair in fashionable style, and bought patches for their cheeks. Cinderella was consulted in these matters, for she had good taste. She advised them always for the best, and even offered her services to dress their hair, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball? Young ladies, she said, you only jeer at me. It is not for such as I am to go there. You are right, they replied. People would laugh to see a cinder witch at the ball. Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their hair awry, but she was good-natured and arranged it perfectly well. They were almost 2 days without eating, so much were they transported with joy. They broke above a dozen laces in trying to lace themselves tight, that they might have a fine, slender shape, and they were continually at their looking glass. At last the happy day came. They went to the court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could. When she had lost sight of them, she fell a crying. Her godmother, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish I could, I wish I could, but she could not finish for sobbing. Her godmother, who was a fairy, said to her, You wish you could go to the ball, is it not so? Alas, yes, said Cinderella, sighing. Well, said her godmother, but be a good girl, and I will see that you go. Then she took her into her chamber and said to her, Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin. Cinderella went at once to gather the finest she could get and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could help her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, leaving nothing but the rind. Then she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine gilded coach. She then went to look into the mousetrap, where she found 6 mice, all alive. She ordered Cinderella to lift the trap door, when giving each mouse, as it went out, a little tap with her wand, it was that moment turned into a fine horse, and the 6 mice made a fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple gray. Being at a loss for coachmen, Cinderella said, I will go and see if there is not a rat in the rat trap. We may make a coachman of him. You are right, replied her godmother. Go and look. Cinderella brought the rat trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy chose the one which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he was turned into a fat coachman with the finest mustache and whiskers ever seen. After that, she said to her, Go into the garden, and you will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me. She had no sooner done so, to her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their liveries all trimmed with gold and silver, and they held on as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, Well, you see here a carriage fit to go to the ball in. Are you not pleased with it? Oh, yes, she cried, but must I go as I am in these rags? Her godmother simply touched her with her wand, and at the same moment her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all decked with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of the prettiest glass slippers in the whole world. Being thus attired, she got into the carriage, her godmother commanding her, above all things, not to stay till after midnight, and telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes would become just as they were before. She promised her godmother she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight. She drove away, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess, whom nobody knew, was come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted from the coach, and led her into the hall where the company were assembled. There was at once a profound silence. Everyone left off dancing, and the violins ceased to play. So attracted was everyone by the singular beauties of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was then heard but a confused sound of voices saying, How beautiful she is! How beautiful she is! The king himself, old as he was, could not keep his eyes off her, and told the queen under his breath that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busy studying their clothes and headdress so that they might have theirs made next day after the same pattern, provided they meet with such fine materials and able hands to make them. The king's son conducted her to the seat of honor, and afterwards took her out to dance with him. She danced so very gracefully that they all admired her more and more. A fine collation was served, but the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he occupied with her. She went and sat down beside her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities, and giving them, among other things, part of the oranges and citrons which the prince had regaled her. This very much surprised him, for they had not presented to her. Cinderella heard the clock strike 1/4 to 12. She at once made her adieus to the company, and hastened away as fast as she could. As soon as she got home, she ran to find her godmother. After having thanked her, she said very much she wished she might go to the ball the next day, because the king's son had asked her to do so. As she was eagerly telling her godmother all that happened at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door. Cinderella opened it. "How long have you stayed?" she said, yawning, rubbing her eyes, and stretching as if she had just been awakened. She had not, however, had any desire to sleep since they went from home. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. There came thither the finest princess, the most beautiful ever was seen with mortal eyes. She showed 1,000 civilities and gave us oranges and citrons." Cinderella did not show any pleasure at this. Indeed, she asked them the name of the princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very much concerned and would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella, smiling, replied, "Was she then so very beautiful? How fortunate you have been! Could I not see her? Oh, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes with which you wear every day." "Ay, to be sure," cried Miss Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to such a dirty cinderwitch as thou art? I shall be out of my mind to do so." Cinderella indeed expected such an answer and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly troubled if her sister had lent her what she jestingly asked for. The next day, the two sisters went to the ball, and so did Cinderella, dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her side, and his pretty speeches too had never ceased. These by no means annoyed the young lady. Indeed, she quite forgot her godmother's orders to her, so that she heard the clock begin to strike 12 when she thought it could not be more than 11. She then rose up and fled as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, without her carriage and in her old clothes, having nothing left of her, all her finery but one of those slippers, fellow to the one she had dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out, and they replied they had seen nobody go out but a young girl, very meanly dressed, and who had more the air of a poor country girl than of a young lady. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had a pleasant time, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but that she hurried away the moment it struck 12, with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up. They said further that he had done nothing but look at her all the time, and that most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful owner of the glass slipper. What they said was true, for a few days after, the king's son caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry for whose foot the slipper would fit exactly. They began to try it on the princesses, then on the duchesses, then on all the ladies of the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they possibly could to thrust a foot into the slipper, but they could not succeed. Cinderella, who saw this and knew her slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out a-laughing and began to banter her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was but just that she should try, and that he had orders to let every lady try it on. He obliged Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her little foot, he found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment on her two sisters was great, but it was still greater that Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon in came her godmother, who, having touched Cinderella's clothes with her wand, made them more magnificent than those she had worn before. And now her two sisters found her to be that beautiful lady they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all their ill treatment of her. Cinderella took them up, and as she embraced them, said she should forgive them with all her heart, and begged them to love her always. She was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her two sisters a home in the palace, and that very same day married them too to great lords of the court. Thank you.
Yay, thank you so much, Sarah. Another beautiful reading there. Thank you. All right, so our next reader up, we have Olivia Jump. So Olivia, whenever you're ready, you can take it away and introduce what you'll be reading.
Hi. I'm going to be reading an abridged version of Beauty and the Beasts. There was once a merchant who had 3 daughters. The 2 older ones were handsome enough, but the third was a beauty, and no mistake. Her eyes were as blue as the sky, her hair was as black as ebony, and her cheeks were like roses. And she was clever as she was handsome. While her sisters spent most of their time at parties, charming, eligible young noblemen, Beauty preferred to read. The merchant loved his 2 older daughters dearly, but this Beauty was the darling of his heart. Things went along pleasantly for a long time, and the merchant was rich and prosperous, but then things began to go wrong with him. One after another of his ships was lost at sea, and a great part of his fortune with them. One day, the merchant called his daughters to him and said, "My children, I find it will be necessary for me to go on a long journey. I am no longer a rich man, but I wish to bring home a gift to each one of you, so tell me what you would like to have." Then the older 2 daughters began to think of all the things they wanted, and each was afraid the other would get something finer than she did. At last the eldest spoke. "Dear father," said she, "I wish you would bring me a velvet robe embroidered with gold, and shoes to match, and a fan to wave in my hand." "And I," said the second, "would like a necklace of pearls, and pearls for my hair, and a fine bracelet." The merchant was troubled that his daughter should ask for such costly things, but he did not like to refuse them. "And you, Beauty," said he, turning to his youngest daughter, "what will you have?" "Dear father," said she, "you have given me so much that I have nothing left to wish for. But if you bring me anything at all, let it be a rose. They are a rarity around here." When her older sisters heard this, they were very angry. They thought that Beauty had asked only for a rose so that she might shame them before their father and make him think she was more unselfish than they were. But Beauty had had no such thought as that. The merchant smiled at his youngest daughter and kissed her thrice, but his older daughters he kissed only once. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. He journeyed on for several days, and at last he reached the city he was bound for. Here he found he had lost even more of his fortune than he had thought. He was now a poor man. Still, he managed to buy the gifts his 2 older daughters had asked for, and then, with a sad heart, he set out for home. He had not journeyed far, however, when he was overtaken by a storm and lost himself in a deep forest. He rode this way and that, trying to find the way out, and then suddenly he came into an open place, and there he saw before him a magnificent castle. The merchant was amazed. He had never heard of such a castle in that forest. He rode up to the door and knocked, hoping to find shelter for the night. Scarcely had he knocked when the great door swung open before him. He entered and looked about. No one was there. Everything was silent. Wondering, he went on into one room after another. Everything was very magnificent and well arranged, but nowhere was a soul to be seen. At last he came to a room where a supper was set out. The plates were all of gold, and the fruits and meats were of the rarest and most delicious kinds. The merchant was so hungry that he sat down at the table, and at once the food was served to him by invisible hands, while soft music sounded from a hidden room beyond. He ate heartily and then arose and went in search of a place to sleep. This he soon found. A bed had been made ready in a large chamber, and here he undressed, and lying down, he slept until morning without being disturbed. When he awoke, he found his own travel-stained clothes had been taken away. In their place, a handsome suit had been laid out, and other necessary things, all of the richest kind. There was also a bag filled with gold pieces. Wondering still more, The merchant arose and dressed and went out into the gardens to look about him. Here, everything was more beautiful than any garden he had ever seen before. There were winding paths and fountains, and fruit trees and flowering plants. Beside one of the fountains was a rose bush covered with roses. The sight of these roses reminded the merchant of Beauty's wish, and he thought it would be no harm to break off one to carry to her. He chose the largest and finest rose. Scarcely had he plucked it, however, when the air was filled with the sound of thunder. The ground rocked under his feet, and a terrible-looking beast appeared before him. "Miserable man," cried the beast, "what have you done? All the best in the castle was offered to you. Why have you broken my rose bush that is dearer to me than anything in the world? Now for this you must surely die." The merchant was terrified. "Oh, dear good beast, do not kill me," he cried. "I meant no harm. Only let me go, and I will never trouble you again." "No, no," answered the beast. "You shall not escape so easily. You have broken my rose bush, and you must suffer for it." Still, the merchant begged and entreated to be spared, and at last the beast had pity on him. "If I spare your life," said he, "what will you give me in return for it?" "Alas," said the merchant, "what can I give you? I have lost all my fortune, and I am now a poor man. I have nothing left in the world but my 3 daughters." "Give me one of your daughters for a wife, and I will be satisfied," said the beast. The merchant was horrified at the thought of such a thing. He would have refused, but he feared that if he did, the beast would tear him to pieces at once. "You may have 3 months in which to think it over," said the beast, "but you must promise me at the end of that time you will return here and either bring me one of your daughters or come prepared to die." The merchant was obliged to promise this. He could not help himself. As soon as he had promised, the beast disappeared and the man was free to go, and this he was not slow to do. He rode on toward his home, and his heart was heavy within him. He did not see how he could possibly give one of his daughters to be the bride of a hideous beast, and yet he did not wish to die. His daughters met him with joy, and the 2 older sisters were delighted when they saw the beautiful gifts he had brought them. Only Beauty noticed his sad and downcast looks. "Dear father," said she, "why are you troubled? Has something unfortunate happened?" At first her father would not tell her, but she urged and entreated him to tell her until finally he could keep silence no longer. He told his daughters all about the castle and his adventure there, and of the beast, and how, unless one of them would consent to marry the beast, he would have to lose his life. When the older daughters heard this, they were ready to faint. Not even to save their father's life could they consent to marry such a creature. "Dear father," said Beauty, "you shall not die. I will be the beast's bride." "Yes, yes," cried her sisters, "that is only right. If Beauty had not asked for the rose, this misfortune would not have happened." To this the merchant would not at first agree. Beauty was the dearest to him of all his daughters. He had hoped that if any of them was to marry the beast, it might be one of the older sisters. But they would not hear of this, and when, at the end of 3 months, the merchant set out to return to the castle, he took Beauty with him. They rode along, and after a while they came to the forest, and then it did not take the merchant long to find the castle. He knocked at the door, and it opened as before, and he and Beauty went in through one room after another, and everything was so magnificent that she could not but admire it. At last they came to the supper room, and here a delicious feast was set out for them. They sat down and ate while soft music sounded around them. Beauty began to think the master of this could not be such a terrible creature after all. But scarcely had they finished their supper before the beast appeared before them, and when Beauty saw him she began to shake and tremble, for he was even more dreadful looking than her father had said. Do not fear me, Beauty, he said in a gentle voice. I will do you no harm. Your father has brought you here, and it is true that you are here, that here you must stay, but you need not marry me unless you are quite willing to. I do not wish to marry you, Beast, and you must know that, said Beauty. But I fear that if I do not, you may harm my father. No, Beauty, I will not harm him. He may go in peace, and perhaps after you have been here a while, you may learn to like me enough to marry me. Beauty did not believe this, but the Beast spoke so gently that she no longer feared him, and when the time came for her father to go, she bade him goodbye and did not grieve him by weeping. After that, Beauty lived there in the Beast's castle and was well content. Every day she read in the grand castle library that the Beast had given her, and went out into the gardens, and the Beast came and played with her for a while, and she grew very fond of him. Every day before he left her, he said, Beauty, are you willing to marry me? But Beauty always answered, No, dear Beast, I do not wish to marry you. Then the Beast would sigh heavily and go away. One day, Beauty was sitting before a large mirror in her room, and she was sad because she had not seen her father for so long. I wish, said she, that I could see what my dear father is doing at this moment. As she said this, she raised her eyes to the mirror. What was her surprise to see in it the reflection of a room quite different from the one she was in. It was a room in her own home that she saw reflected there. She saw in it the images of her father and sisters. She could not see them she could see them smile and move, and she could tell exactly what they were doing. She found she could watch them in the mirror for as long as she pleased, and whenever she pleased. After this, Beauty often came to sit before the mirror, and she had only to wish it, and she could see her home and all that was going on there. But one day, when she sat down before the glass, she saw that her father was ill. He lay upon his bed so pale and weak that Beauty was terrified. She jumped up and ran into the garden, calling for the Beast. At once he appeared before her. What is it? Asked the Beast anxiously. What has frightened you, Beauty? Alas, she cried, my father is ill. Oh, dear, kind Beast, let me go to him, I pray, and I will love you forever and ever. The Beast looked very grave. Very well, Beauty, he said. I will let you go, for I can refuse you nothing. But promise me you will return at the end of a week, for if you do not come, some great misfortune will happen to me. Beauty was very willing to promise this. The Beast then gave her a ring set with a large ruby. When you go to bed tonight, he said, turn the ruby in toward the palm of your hand and wish you were in your father's house, and in the morning you will find you are there. When you are ready to return, do the same, and you will find yourself back in the castle again. And do not forget that by the end of a week, to an hour, you must return, or you will bring suffering upon me. Beauty did as the Beast told her. That night, when she laid down, she turned the ruby of the ring in toward the palm of her hand and wished she were in her father's house. And what was her joy when she awakened the next morning to find herself in her own bed at home. She arose and ran to her father's room, and the merchant was so delighted to see her that from the hour he began to get better, and in a few days he was as well as ever again. Beauty's sisters asked her a great many questions about the castle where she lived, and when they heard how fine it was and how happy she was there, they were filled with envy. Beauty always gets the best of everything, they said to each other. See, she is younger than either of us, and see how finely she lives, much better than we do. Then they planned together as to how they could keep Beauty from going back to the castle at the end of the week. If we can only make her break her promise to the Beast, said they, he might be so angry with her that he would send her away and take one of us to live at his castle instead. The day before Beauty was to return to the Beast, they put a sleeping powder in the goblet that she drank from. As soon as Beauty had swallowed this powder, she became very sleepy. Her eyelids weighed like lead, and presently she fell into a deep slumber, and she did not awaken for 2 nights and days. At the end of that time, Beauty had a dream, and in her dream she walked in the castle gardens. She came to the rose bush beside the fountain, and there lay the poor beast stretched out on the ground, and he was almost dead. He opened his eyes and looked at her sadly. "Ah, Beauty, Beauty," he said, "why did you break your promise to return at the end of a week? See what suffering you have brought on me." Beauty awoke, sobbing bitterly. "Alas, alas!" she cried. "I must go at once. I feel some harm has come to the beast, and that it is my fault, though how I do not know." For she did not know she had been asleep for 2 days and nights. She turned the ruby ring with the ruby toward the palm of her hand and wished herself back in the castle, and then lay down and went to sleep. When she awoke, she was in the castle again, and it was early morning. She ran out into the garden and straight to the rose bush. There, as in her dream, she saw the beast stretched out on the ground, and he seemed to be without life or breath. Beauty threw herself down on the ground and took his head in her lap, and her tears ran down and fell upon him, and it seemed to her that she did not love even her father as dearly as she loved the beast. "Oh, beast, dear, dear beast," she cried, "can you not hear me? Are you quite dead?" Then the beast opened his eyes and looked at her. "Ah, Beauty," he said, "I thought you had deserted me. Do you not yet love me enough to marry me?" "Oh, I do love you enough, and gladly I will be your bride," cried Beauty. No sooner than she had said this than the rough furry hide of the beast fell apart, and a handsome young prince, all dressed in white satin and silver, stood before her. Beauty looked at him wondering. "Yes, you shall indeed be my own dear bride," cried the beast, "for you and you alone have broken the enchantment that held me." Then the prince, a beast no longer, told Beauty that a wicked fairy had changed him into the shape of a beast, and not until a fair young maiden would love him enough to be his bride would the enchantment be broken. But Beauty had loved him for his kindness and goodness in spite of his ugly form, and now never again could the wicked fairy have any power over him. And now through all the castle there was heard a sound of life and voices and of running to and fro. For the same enchantment that had changed the prince to a beast had made all his people invisible, and now they too were freed from the spell. Then how happy Beauty was! If she had loved the beast, she had loved the handsome young prince in his true form 1,000 times better. A great wedding feast was prepared, and her father and sisters were sent for. Her father was given the place of honor, but it was quite different with her sisters. Because of their hard hearts, they were changed into statues, and they stood on one on either side of the doorway. But Beauty was too gentle to bear them any ill will. After she was married, she often used to go and stand behind the statues and talk to them, and her tears fell upon them so that after a while their hard hearts grew soft and the stone melted back to flesh again. They were very happy together. The 2 sisters were married to 2 noblemen of the court. As for the Beauty and the prince, nothing could equal their love for each other. They lived happily forever after, and no further harm ever came to them.
Yay! Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you for another great story reading. That was lovely. All right, so we have just one last story to share with you all. This one I'll be reading for you. It's actually an excerpt from the novel Persuasion by Jane Austen. To anyone who isn't familiar with this story, that's totally fine. Basically, what you need to know for this excerpt is that this is the story of a young woman named Anne Elliot. And in this story, she was proposed to by a man named Captain Frederick Wentworth 8.5 years ago. And even though she loved him, she turned him down because one of her mentors close to her thought he wasn't good enough or rich enough or of a highest status. high enough status. So she refused him. And now this is fast forwarded 8 years. And Captain Wentworth has returned to town. And in this scene, this is near the end of the novel, Anne is talking with some of her friends, particularly her friend Captain Harville at the beginning of the excerpt. And we'll see what they have to say and what Captain Wentworth's response is. So without further ado, here is an excerpt from Persuasion. "Ah," cried Captain Harville in a tone of strong feeling, "if I could but make you comprehend what a man suffers when he takes a last look at his wife and children and watches the boat that he has sent them off in as long as it is in sight, and then turns away and says, 'God knows whether we ever meet again,' and then if I could convey to you the glow of his soul when he does see them again, when coming back after a 12-month's absence, perhaps, and obliged to put into another port, he calculates how soon it be possible to get them there, pretending to deceive himself and saying, 'They cannot be here till such a day,' but all the while hoping for them 12 hours sooner, and seeing them arrive at last, as if heaven had given them wings, by many hours sooner still. If I could explain to you all this, and all that a man can bear and do, and glories to do, for the sake of these treasures of his existence, I speak, you know, only of such men as have hearts," pressing his own with emotion. "Oh," cried Anne eagerly, "I hope I do justice to all that is felt by you, and by those who resemble you. God forbid that I should undervalue the warm and faithful feelings of any of my fellow creatures. I should deserve utter contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were known only by woman. No, I believe you capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion and to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives, and lives for you. All the privilege I claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving longest, when existence or when hope is gone." She could not immediately have uttered another sentence. Her heart was too full, her breath too much oppressed. "You are a good soul," cried Captain Harville, putting his hand on her arm quite affectionately. "There is no quarreling with you. And when I think of Benwick, my tongue is tied." Their attention was called toward the others. Mrs. Croft was taking leave. "Here, Frederick, you and I part company, I believe," said she. "I am going home, and you have an engagement with your friend. Tonight we may have the pleasure of all meeting again at your party." Turning to Anne, "We had your sister's card yesterday, and I understood Frederick had a card too, though I did not see it. And you are disengaged, Frederick, are you not, as well as ourselves?" Captain Wentworth was folding up a letter in great haste, and either could not or would not fully answer. "Yes," said he, "very true. Here we separate. But Harville and I shall soon be after you. That is, Harville, if you are ready. I am in half a minute. I know you will not be sorry to be off. I shall be at your service in half a minute." Mrs. Croft left them, and Captain Wentworth, having sealed his letter with great rapidity, was indeed ready, and had even a hurried, agitated air, which shewed impatience to be gone. Anne knew not how to understand it. She had the kindest "Good morning, God bless you," from Captain Harville, but from him not a word, nor a look. He had passed out of the room without a look. She had only time, however, to move closer to the table where he had been writing, when footsteps were heard returning. The door opened. It was himself. He begged their pardon, but he had forgotten his gloves, and instantly crossing the room to the writing table, he drew out a letter from under the scattered paper, placed it before Anne with eyes of glowing entreaty fixed on her for a time, and, hastily collecting his gloves, was again out of the room, almost before Mrs. Musgrove was aware of his being in it. The work of an instant. The revolution which one instant had made in Anne was almost beyond expression. The letter, with a direction hardly legible, to Miss A.E., was evidently the one which he had been folding so hastily. While supposed to be writing only to Captain Benwick, he had been also addressing her. On the contents of the letter depended all which this world could do for her. Anything was possible. Anything might be defied rather than suspense. Mrs. Musgrove had little arrangements of her own at her table. To their protection she must trust. And sinking into the chair which he had occupied, succeeding to the very spot where he had leaned and written, her eyes devoured the following words. I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8 years and a half ago. Dare not say that man forgets sooner than woman, that his love has an earlier death. I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. You alone have brought me to Bath. For you alone I think and plan. Have you not seen this? Can you fail to have understood my wishes? I had not waited even these 10 days, could I have read your feelings as I think you must have penetrated mine. I can hardly write. I am every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others. Too good, too excellent creature! You do us justice indeed. You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be most fervent, most undeviating, in F.W. I must go, uncertain of my fate, but I shall return hither, or follow your party as soon as possible. A word, a look will be enough to decide whether I enter your father's house this evening or never. Such a letter was not to be soon recovered from. Half an hour's solitude and reflection might have tranquilized her, but the 10 minutes only which now passed before she was interrupted, with all the restraints of her situation, could do nothing towards tranquility. Every moment rather brought fresh agitation. It was overpowering happiness. And before she was beyond the first stage of full sensation, Charles, Mary, and Henrietta all came in. The absolute necessity of seeming like herself produced then an immediate struggle, but after a while she could do no more. She began not to understand a word they said, and was obliged to plead indisposition and excuse herself. They could then see that she looked very ill, were shocked and concerned, and would not stir without her for the world. This was dreadful. Would they only have gone away and left her in the quiet possession of that room, it would have been her cure. But to have them all standing or waiting around her was distracting, and in desperation she said she would go home. By all means, my dear, cried Mrs. Musgrove. Go home directly and take care of yourself, that you may be fit for the evening. I wish Sarah was here to doctor you, but I am no doctor myself. Charles, ring and order a chair. She must not walk. But the chair would never do. Worse than all, to lose the possibility of speaking 2 words to Captain Wentworth in the course of her quiet, solitary progress up the town, and she felt almost certain of meeting him, could not be borne. The chair was earnestly protested against, and Mrs. Musgrove, who thought only of one sort of illness, having assured herself with some anxiety that there had been no fall in that case, that Anne had not at any time lately slipped down and got a blow on her head, that she was perfectly convinced of having had no fall, could part with her cheerfully, and depend on finding her better at night. Anxious to omit no possible precaution, Anne struggled and said, I am afraid, ma'am, that it is not perfectly understood. Pray be so good as to mention to the other gentlemen that we hope to see your whole party this evening. I am afraid there has been some mistake, and I wish you particularly to assure Captain Harville and Captain Wentworth that we hope to see them both. Oh, my dear, it is quite understood, I give you my word. Captain Harville has no thought but of going. Do you think so? But I am afraid, and I should be so very sorry. Will you promise me to mention it when you see them again? You will see them both this morning, I dare say. Do promise me. To be sure, I will, if you wish it. Charles, if you see Captain Harville anywhere, remember to give Miss Anne's message. But indeed, my dear, you need not be uneasy. Captain Harville holds himself quite engaged, I'll answer for it, and Captain Wentworth the same, I dare say. Anne could do no more, but her heart prophesied some mischance to damp the perfection of her felicity. It could not be very lasting, however. Even if he did not come to Camden Place himself, it would be in her power to send an intelligible sentence by Captain Harville. Another momentary vexation occurred. Charles, in his real concern and good nature, would go home with her. There was no preventing him. This was almost cruel, but she could not be so long ungrateful. He was sacrificing an engagement at a gunsmith's to be of use to her, and she set off with him, with no feeling but gratitude apparent. They were on Union Street when a quick step behind, a something of a familiar sound, gave her 2 moments' presentation for the sight of Captain Wentworth. He joined them, but as if irresolute whether to join or to pass on, said nothing, only looked. Anne could command herself enough to receive that look, and not repulsively. The cheeks which had been pale now glowed, and the movements which had hesitated were decided. He walked by her side. Presently, struck by a sudden thought, Charles said, "Captain Wentworth, which way are you going? Only to Gay Street or farther up to town?" "I hardly know," replied Captain Wentworth, surprised. "Are you going as high as Belmont? Are you going near Camden Place? Because if you are, I shall have no scruple in asking you to take my place, and give Anne your arm to her father's door. She is rather done for this morning, and must not go so far without help, and I ought to be at that fellow's in the marketplace." There could be no objection. There could be only the most proper alacrity, a most obliging compliance for public view, and smiles reigned in and spirits dancing in private rapture. In half a minute, Charles was at the bottom of Union Street again, and the other 2 proceeding together, and soon words enough had passed between them to decide their direction towards the comparatively quiet and retired gravel walk, where the power of conversation would make the present hour a blessing indeed, and prepare it for all the immortality which the happiest of recollections of their own future lives could bestow. There they exchanged again those feelings and those promises which had once before seemed to secure everything, but which had been followed by so many, many years of division and estrangement. There they returned again into the past, more exquisitely happy perhaps in their reunion than when it had been first projected, more tender, more tried, more fixed in a knowledge of each other's character, truth, and attachment, more equal to act, more justified in acting. And there, as they slowly paced the gradual ascent, heedless of every group around them, they could indulge in those retrospections and acknowledgments, and especially in those explanations of what had directly preceded the present moment, which were so poignant, and so ceaseless in interest. All the little variations of the last week were gone through, and of yesterday and today there could scarcely be an end. Thank you so much. That was the last story of the evening. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you had a good time this evening. Thank you to all of our wonderful readers. Let's have a round of applause for Sarah, Bhavana, Adam, Olivia, Adam, everybody who read. Thank you so much. Thank you for your lovely readings of these stories, and I hope everyone enjoyed. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.